Chapter 10 of The Life of Harriet Beecher Stowe, compiled from her letters and journals by her son Charles Edward Stowe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10, From Over the Sea, 1853. The Earl of Carlisle, Arthur Helps, the Duke and Duchess of Argyll, Martin Fauquier Tupper, a memorable meeting at Stafford House, Macaulay and Dean Milman, Windsor Castle, Professor Stowe returns to America, Mrs. Stowe on the Continent, Impressions of Paris, en route to Switzerland and Germany, back to England, homeward bound. Rose Cottage, Walworth, London, May 2nd, 1856. My dear, this morning Mrs. Follen called and we had quite a chat. We were separated by the whole city. She lives at the West End, while I am down here in Walworth, which is one of the postscripts of London, for this place has as many postscripts as a lady's letter. This evening we dined with the Earl of Carlisle. There was no company but ourselves, for he, with great consideration, said in his note that he thought a little quiet would be the best thing he could offer. Lord Carlisle is a great friend to America, and so is his sister, the Duchess of Sutherland. He is the only English traveler who ever wrote notes on our country in a real spirit of appreciation. We went about 7 o'clock, the dinner hour being here somewhere between 8 and 9. We were shown into an anteroom adjoining the entrance hall, and from that into an adjacent apartment, where we met Lord Carlisle. The room had a pleasant social air, warmed and enlivened by the blaze of a coal fire and wax candles. We had never, any of us, met Lord Carlisle before, but the considerateness and cordiality of our reception obviated whatever embarrassment there might have been in this circumstance. In a few moments after we were all seated, a servant announced the Duchess of Sutherland, and Lord Carlisle presented me. She is tall and stately, with a most noble bearing. Her fair complexion, blonde hair, and full lips speak of Saxon blood. The only person present not of the family connection was my quondam correspondent in America, Arthur Helps. Somehow or other I had formed the impression from his writings that he was a venerable sage of very advanced years, who contemplated life as an aged hermit from the door of his cell. Conceive my surprise to find a genial young man of about 25, who looked as if he might enjoy a joke as well as another man. After the ladies left the table, the conversation turned on the Maine law, which seemed to be considered over here as a phenomenon in legislation, and many of the gentlemen present inquired about it with great curiosity. After the gentlemen rejoined us, the Duke and Duchess of Argyll came in, and Lord and Lady Blantyre. These ladies are the daughters of the Duchess of Sutherland. The Duchess of Argyll is of slight and fairy-like figure, with flaxen hair and blue eyes, answering well enough to the description of Annot Lyle in the Legend of Montrose. Lady Blantyre was somewhat taller, of fuller figure, with a very brilliant bloom. Lord Blantyre is of the Stuart blood, a tall and slender young man with very graceful manners. As to the Duke of Argyll, we found that the picture drawn of him by his countrymen in Scotland was in every way correct. Though slight of figure, with fair complexion and blue eyes, his whole appearance is indicative of energy and vivacity. His talents and efficiency have made him a member of the British Cabinet at a much earlier age than is usual, and he has distinguished himself not only in political life, but as a writer, having given to the world a work on Presbyterianism, embracing an analysis of the ecclesiastical history of Scotland since the Reformation, which is spoken of as written with great ability and in a most liberal spirit. He made many inquiries about our distinguished men, particularly of Emerson, Longfellow, and Hawthorne, also of Prescott, who appears to be a general favorite here. I felt at the moment that we never value our own literary men so much as when we are placed in a circle of intelligent foreigners. The following evening we went to dine with our old friends of the dingle, Mr. and Mrs. Edward Cropper, who are now spending a little time in London. We were delighted to meet them once more, and to hear from our Liverpool friends. Mrs. Cropper's father, Lord Denman, has returned to England, though with no sensible improvements to his health. At dinner we were introduced to Lord and Lady Hatherton. Lady Hatherton is a person of great cultivation and intelligence, warmly interested in all the progressive movements of the day, and I gained much information in her society. There were also present Sir Charles and Lady Trevelyan. The former holds an appointment at the Treasury, and Lady Trevelyan is a sister of Macaulay. In the evening quite a circle came in, among others Lady Emma Campbell, sister of the Duke of Argyll, the daughters of the Archbishop of Canterbury, who very kindly invited me to visit them at Lambeth, and Mr. Arthur Helps, besides many others whose name I need not mention. May 7th. This evening our house was opened in a general way for callers, who were coming and going all evening. I think there must have been over 200 people, among them Martin Farquhar Tupper, a little man with fresh rosy complexion and cheery joyous manners, and Mary Howitt, just such a cheerful, sensible fireside companion as we find her in her books, winning love and trust the very moment of the interview. The general topic of remark on meeting me seems to be that I am not so bad-looking as they were afraid I was, and I do assure you that when I have seen the things that are put up in the shop windows here with my name under them, I have been in wondering admiration at the boundless loving kindness of my English and Scottish friends in keeping up such a warm heart for such a gorgon. I should think that the Sphinx in the London Museum might have sat for most of them. I am going to make a collection of these portraits to bring home to you. There is a great variety of them, and they will be useful, like the Irishman's Guide Board, which showed where the road did not go. Before the evening was through, I was talked out and worn out. There was hardly a chip of me left. Tomorrow at 11 o'clock comes the meeting at Stafford House. What it will amount to I do not know, but I take no thought for the morrow. May 8th. My dear C., in fulfillment of my agreement, I will tell you, as nearly as I can remember, all the details of the meeting at Stafford House. At about 11 o'clock we drove under the arched carriageway of a mansion externally not very showy in appearance. When the Duchess appeared, I thought she looked handsomer by daylight than in the evening. She received us with the same warm and simple kindness which she had shown before. We were presented to the Duke of Sutherland. He is a tall, slender man, with a rather thin face, light brown hair, and a mild blue eye, with an air of gentleness and dignity. Among the first that entered were the members of the family, the Duke and Duchess of Argyll, Lord and Lady Blantyre, the Marquis and Marchioness of Stafford, and Lady Emma Campbell. Then followed Lady Shaftesbury with his beautiful lady, and her father and mother, Lord and Lady Palmerston. Lord Palmerston is of middle height, with a keen dark eye, and black hair streaked with grey. There is something peculiarly alert and vivacious about all his movements. In short, his appearance perfectly answers to what we know of him from his public life. One has a strange mythological feeling about the existence of people of whom one hears for many years without ever seeing them. While talking with Lord Palmerston, I could but remember how often I had heard Father and Mr. S. exulting over his foreign dispatches by our own fireside. There were present also Lord John Russell, Mr. Gladstone, and Lord Granville. The latter we all thought very strikingly resembled in his appearance the poet Longfellow. After lunch the whole party ascended to the picture gallery, passing on our way the grand staircase and hall, said to be the most magnificent in Europe. The company now began to assemble and throng the gallery, and very soon the vast room was crowded. Among the throng I remember many presentations, but of course must have forgotten many more. Archbishop Whately was there, with Mrs. and Miss Whately, Macaulay, with two of his sisters, Milman, the poet and historian, the Bishop of Oxford, Chevalier Bunsen and lady, and many more. When all the company were together, Lord Shaftesbury read a very short, kind, and considerate address in behalf of the ladies of England, expressive of their cordial welcome. This Stafford House meeting, in any view of it, is a most remarkable fact. Kind and gratifying as its arrangements have been to me, I am far from appropriating it to myself individually as a personal honor. I rather regard it as the most public expression possible of the feelings of the women of England on one of the most important questions of our day, that of individual liberty considered in its religious bearings." On this occasion the Duchess of Sutherland presented Mrs. Stowe with a superb gold bracelet made in the form of a slave's shackle, bearing the inscription, "We trust it is a memorial of a chain that is soon to be broken." On two of the links were inscribed the dates of the abolition of the slave trade and of slavery in English territory. Years after its presentation to her, Mrs. Stowe was able to have engraved on the clasp of this bracelet, "Constitutional Amendment forever abolishing slavery in the United States." Continuing her interesting journal, Mrs. Stowe writes, May 9th, "Dear E., this letter I consecrate to you, because I know that the persons and things to be introduced into it will most particularly be appreciated by you. In your evening reading circles, Macaulay, Sydney Smith, and Milman have long been such familiar names that you will be glad to go with me over all the scenes of my morning breakfast at Sir Charles Trevelyan's yesterday. Lady Trevelyan, I believe I have said before, is a sister of Macaulay. We were set down at Westbourne Terrace somewhere, I believe, about 11 o'clock, and found quite a number already in the drawing-room. I had met Macaulay before, but being seated between him and Dean Milman, I must confess I was a little embarrassed at times, because I wanted to hear what they were both saying at the same time. However, by the use of the faculty by which you play a piano with both hands, I got on very comfortably. There were several other persons of note present at this breakfast, whose conversation I had not an opportunity of hearing, as they sat at a distance from me. There was Lord Gleniegg, brother of Sir Robert Grant, Governor of Bombay, whose beautiful hymns have rendered him familiar in America, the favourite one commencing, "When gathering clouds around I view," was from his pen. The historian Hallam was also present, and I think it very likely there may have been other celebrities whom I did not know. I am always finding out, a day or two after, that I have been with somebody very remarkable and did not know it at the time." Under date of May 18th, she writes to her sister Mary, "Dear M., I can compare the embarrassment of our London life, with its multiplied solicitations and infinite stimulants to curiosity and desire, only to that annual perplexity which used to beset us in our childhood on Thanksgiving Day. Like Miss Edgeworth's philosophical little Frank, we are obliged to make out a list of what man must want and of what he may want, and in our list of the former we set down, in large and decisive characters, 1 quiet day for the exploration and enjoyment of Windsor." The ride was done all too soon. About 11 o'clock we found ourselves going up the old stone steps to the castle. We went first through the state apartments. The principal thing that interested me was the ballroom, which was a perfect gallery of Van Dyck's paintings. After leaving the ballroom, we filed off to the proper quarter to show our orders for the private rooms. The state apartments, which we had been looking at, are open at all times, but the private apartments can only be seen in the Queen's absence, and by a special permission, which had been procured for us on that occasion by the kindness of the Duchess of Sutherland. One of the first objects that attracted my attention upon entering the vestibule was a baby's wicker wagon, standing in one corner. It was much such a carriage as all mothers are familiar with, such as figures largely in the history of almost every family. It had neat curtains and cushions of green merino, and was not royal, only maternal. I mused over the little thing with a good deal of interest. We went for our dinner to the White Hart, the very inn which Shakespeare celebrates in his Merry Wives, and had a most overflowing merry time of it. After dinner we had a beautiful drive. We were bent upon looking up the church which gave rise to Gray's Elegy in a Country Churchyard, intending when we got there to have a little scene over it, Mr. S., in all the conscious importance of having been there before, assuring us that he knew exactly where it was. So, after some difficulty with our coachman, and being stopped at one church which would not answer our purpose in any respect, we were at last set down by one which looked authentic, embowered in mossy elms, with a most ancient and goblin yew-tree, an ivy-mantled tower, all perfect as could be. Here, leaning on the old fence, we repeated the elegy, which certainly applies here as beautifully as language could apply. Imagine our chagrin on returning to London at being informed that we had not been to the genuine churchyard after all. The gentleman who wept over the scenes of his early days on the wrong doorstep was not more grievously disappointed. However, he and we could both console ourselves with the reflection that the emotion was admirable, and wanted only the right place to make it the most appropriate in the world. The evening after our return from Windsor we spent with our kind friends, Mr. and Mrs. Gurney. After breakfast the next day, Mr. S., C., and I drove out to call upon Kossuth. We found him in an obscure lodging on the outskirts of London. I would that some of the editors in America who have thrown out insinuations about his living in luxury could have seen the utter bareness and plainness of the reception-room, which had nothing in it beyond the simplest necessities. He entered into conversation with us with cheerfulness, speaking English well, though with the idioms of foreign languages. When we parted, he took my hand kindly and said, "God bless you, my child." I have been quite amused with something which has happened lately. This week the Times has informed the United Kingdom that Mrs. Stowe is getting a new dress made. It wants to know if Mrs. Stowe is aware what sort of a place her dress is being made in, and there is a letter from a dressmaker's apprentice stating that it is being made up piecemeal in the most shockingly distressed dens of London by poor miserable white slaves, worse treated than the plantation slaves of America. Now, Mrs. Stowe did not know anything of this, but simply gave the silk into the hands of a friend, and was in due time waited on in her apartment by a very respectable-appearing woman, who offered to make the dress, and lo, this is the result. Since the publication of this piece, I have received earnest missives from various parts of the country, begging me to interfere, hoping that I was not going to patronize the white slavery of England, and that I would employ my talents equally against oppression in every form. Could these people only know in what sweet simplicity I had been living in the state of Maine, where the only dressmaker of our circle was an intelligent, refined, well-educated woman who was considered as the equal of us all, and whose spring and fall ministrations to our wardrobe were regarded a double pleasure, a friendly visit as well as a domestic assistance. I say, could they know all this, they would see how guiltless I was in the matter. I verily never thought but that the nice, pleasant person who came to measure me for my silk dress was going to take it home and make it herself. It never occurred to me that she was the head of an establishment." May 22nd, she writes to her husband, whose duties had obliged him to return to America, "Today we went to hear a sermon in behalf of the ragged schools by the Archbishop of Canterbury. My thoughts have been much saddened by the news which I received of the death of Mary Edmondson." May 30th. The next day from my last letter came off Mrs. Greenfield's concert, of which I send a card. You see in what company they have put your poor little wife. Funny, isn't it? Well, the honourables and right honourables were all there. I sat by Lord Carlisle. After the concert, the Duchess asked Lady Hatherton and me to come round to Stafford House and take tea, which was not a thing to be despised, either on account of the tea or the Duchess. A lovelier time we never had. Present, the Duchess of Argyle, Lady Caroline Campbell, Lady Hatherton, and myself. We had the nicest cup of tea, with such cream and grapes and apricots, with some Italian bread, etc. When we were going, the Duchess got me, on some pretext, into another room, and came up and put her arms around me, with her noble face all full of feeling. "Oh, Mrs. Stowe, I have been reading that last chapter in the key. Argyle read it aloud to us. Oh, surely, surely you will succeed. God surely will bless you." I said then that I thanked her for all her love and feeling for us, told her how earnestly all the women of England sympathized with her, and many in America. She looked really radiant and inspired. Had those who hang back from our cause seen her face, it might have put a soul into them, as she said again, "It will be done, it will be done. Oh, I trust and pray it may." So we kissed each other and vowed friendship and fidelity, so I came away. Today I am going with Lord Shaftesbury to St. Paul's to see the charity children, after which lunch with Dean Milman. May 21st. We went to lunch with Miss R. at Oxford Terrace, where, among a number of distinguished guests, was Lady Byron, with whom I had a few moments of deeply interesting conversation. No engravings that ever have been circulated in America do any justice to her appearance. She is of slight figure, formed with exceeding delicacy, and her whole form, face, dress, and air unite to make an impression of a character singularly dignified, gentle, pure, and yet strong. No words addressed to me in any conversation hitherto have made their way to my inner soul with such force as a few remarks dropped by her on the present religious aspects of England, remarks of such quality as one seldom hears. According to request, I will endeavor to keep you informed of all our goings-on after you left, up to the time of our departure for Paris. We have borne in mind your advice to hasten away to the Continent. Charles wrote, a day or two since, to Mrs. C. at Paris to secure very private lodgings, and by no means let anyone know that we were coming. She has replied urging us to come to her house, and promising entire seclusion and rest. So, since you departed, we have been passing with a kind of comprehensive skip and jump over remaining engagements, and just the evening after you left came off the presentation of the inkstand by the ladies of Surrey Chapel. It is a beautiful specimen of silver work, 18 inches long, with a group of silver figures on it representing religion, with the Bible in her hand giving liberty to the slave. The slave is a masterly piece of work. He stands with his hands clasped, looking up to heaven, while a white man is knocking the shackles from his feet. But the prettiest part of the scene was the presentation of a gold pen by a band of beautiful children, one of whom made a very pretty speech. I called the little things to come and stand around me, and talked with them a few minutes, and this was all the speaking that fell to my share. Tomorrow we go to quiet, to obscurity, to peace, to Paris, to Switzerland. There we shall find the loveliest glen, and, as the Bible says, fall on sleep. Paris, June 4th. Here we are in Paris, in a most charming family. I have been out all the morning exploring shops, streets, boulevards, and seeing and hearing life in Paris. When one has a pleasant home and friends to return to, this gay, bustling, vivacious, graceful city is one of the most charming things in the world, and we have a most charming home. I wish the children could see these Tuileries, with their statues and fountains, men, women, and children seated in family groups under the trees, chatting, reading aloud, working muslin, children driving hoop, playing ball, all alive and chattering French. Such fresh, pretty girls as are in the shops here. Je suis ravée, as they say. In short, I am decidedly in a French humor, and am taking things quite couleur de rose. Monday, June 13th. We went this morning to the studio of Monsieur Belloc, who is to paint my portrait. The first question which he proposed, with a genuine French air, was the question of pose, or position. It was concluded that as other pictures have taken me looking at the spectator, this should take me looking away. Monsieur Belloc remarked that Monsieur Charpentier said I appeared always with the air of an observer, was always looking around on everything. Hence, Monsieur Belloc would take me une observatrice, mais pas une curieuse, with an air of observation, but not of curiosity. By and by, Monsieur Charpentier came in. He began panegyrizing Uncle Tom, and this led to a discussion of the ground of its unprecedented success. In his 35 years' experience as a bookseller, he had known nothing like it. It surpassed all modern writings. At first he would not read it. His taste was for old masters of a century or two ago. Like Monsieur Belloc in painting, said I. At length he found his friend M., the first intelligence of the age, reading it. "What, you too?" said he. "Ah, ah," replied the friend, "say nothing about this book. There is nothing like it. This leaves us all behind, all miles behind." Monsieur Belloc said the reason was because there was in it more genuine faith than in any book, and we branched off into florid eloquence touching paganism, Christianity, and art. Wednesday, June 22nd. Adieu to Paris. Ho for Chalon-sur-Saône. After affectionate farewells of our kind friends, by 11 o'clock we were rushing in the pleasantest of cars, over the smoothest of rails, through Burgundy. We arrived at Chalon at 9 p.m. Thursday, 23rd, 8 o'clock a.m. Since 5 we have had a fine bustle on the quay below our windows. There lay 3 steamers, shaped for all the world like our last night's rolls. One would think Ichabod Crane might sit astride one of them and dip his feet in the water. They ought to be swift. La Rondelle, the Swallow, flew at 5, another at 6. We leave at 9. Lyons. There was a scene of indescribable confusion upon our arrival here. Out of the hold of our steamer, a man with a rope and hook began hauling baggage up a smooth board. 300 people were sorting their goods without checks. Porters were shouldering immense loads, 4 or 5 heavy trunks at once, corded together, and stalking off Atlantean. Hat boxes, band boxes, and valises burst like a meteoric shower out of a crater. "À moi," was the cry, from old men, young women, soldiers, shopkeepers, and frères, scuffling and shoving together. Saturday, June 25. Lyons to Genève. As this was our first experience in the diligence line, we noted particularly every peculiarity. I had the idea that a diligence was a rickety, slow-molten, antediluvian nondescript, toiling patiently along over impassable roads at a snail's pace. Judge of my astonishment at finding it a full-blooded, vigorous monster of unscrupulous railway momentum and imperturbable equipoise of mind. Down the macadamized slopes we thundered at a prodigious pace. Up the hills we trotted with 6 horses, 3 abreast. Madly through the little towns we burst like a whirlwind, crashing across the pebbled streets and out upon the broad, smooth road again. Before we had well considered the fact that we were out of Lyons, we stopped to change horses. Done in a jiffy, and whoop, quick, crack, whack, rumble, bump, whir, whisk, away we blazed, till, ere we knew it, another change and another. As evening drew on, a wind sprang up, and a storm seemed gathering on the Jura. The rain dashed against the panes of the berlin as we rode past the grim-faced monarch of the misty shroud. It was night as we drove into Geneva and stopped at the Messagerie. I heard with joy a voice demanding if this were Madame Beecher. I replied, not without some scruples of conscience, "Oui, monsieur, c'est moi," though the name did not sound exactly like the one to which I had been wont to respond. In half an hour we were at home in the mansion of Monsieur Fazil. End quote. From Geneva the party made a tour of the Swiss Alps, spending some weeks among them. While there, Charles Beecher wrote from a small hotel at the foot of the Jura. Quote, "The people of the neighborhood, having discovered who Harriet was, were very kind, and full of delight at seeing her. It was Scotland over again. We have had to be unflinching to prevent her being overwhelmed, both in Paris and Geneva, by the same demonstrations of regard. To this we were driven, as a matter of life and death. It was touching to listen to the talk of these secluded mountaineers. The good hostess, even the servant maids, hung about Harriet, expressing such tender interest for the slave. All had read Uncle Tom, and it had apparently been an era in their life's monotony, for they said, "Oh, madam, do write another. Remember, our winter nights here are very long." Upon their return to Geneva, they visited the castle of Chillon, of which, in describing the dungeons, Mrs. Stowe writes, "One of the pillars in this vault is covered with names. I think it is Bonnivard's pillar. There are the names of Byron, Hunt, Schiller, and ever so many more celebrities. As we were going from the cell, our conductress seemed to have a sudden light upon her mind. She asked a question or two of some of our party, and fell upon me vehemently to put my name also there. Charlie scratched it on the soft freestone, and there it is for future ages. The lady could scarce repress her enthusiasm. She shook my hand over and over again, and said she had read Uncle Tom. It is beautiful, she said, but it is cruel." Monday, July 18. Weather suspicious. Stowed ourselves and our baggage into our voiture, and bade adieu to our friends and to Geneva. Ah, how regretfully! From the market-place we carried away a basket of cherries and fruit as a consolation, dined at Lausanne, and visited the cathedral and picture gallery, where was an exquisite Eva, slept at Meudon, rode through Payerne to Freiburg, stopped at the Zahringer Hof, most romantic of inns. Wednesday, July 20. Examined not the lions, but the bears of Bern, engaged a voiture, and drove to Thun, dined and drove by the shore of the lake of Interlachen, arriving just after a brilliant sunset. We crossed the Wengern Alps to Grindelwald. The Jungfrau is right over against us, her glaciers purer, tenderer, more dazzlingly beautiful, if possible, than those of Mont Blanc. Slept at Grindelwald." From Rosenlaui on this journey, Charles Beecher writes, Friday, June 22nd, Grindelwald to Meiringen. On we came to the top of the great Scheindeck, where H. and W. botanized while I slept. Thence we rode down the mountain till we reached Rosenlaui, where, I am free to say, a dinner was to me a more interesting object than a glacier. Therefore, while H. and W. went to the latter, I turned off to the inn, amid their cries and reproaches. Here, then, I am, writing these notes in the salle à manger of the inn, where other voyagers are eating and drinking, and there is H. feeding on the green moonshine of an emerald ice cave. One would almost think her incapable of fatigue. How she skips up and down high places and steep places, to the manifest perplexity of the honest guide, Keinholz, père, who tries to take care of her, but does not exactly know how. She gets on a pyramid of debris, which the edge of the glacier is ploughing and grinding up, sits down, and falls, not exactly asleep, but into a trance. W. and I are ready to go on. We shout, our voices lost in the roar of the torrent. We send a guide. He goes down and stands doubtfully. He does not know exactly what to do. She hears him and starts to her feet, pointing with one hand to yonder peak, and with the other to that knife-like edge which seems cleaving heaven with its keen and glistening scimitar of snow, reminding one of Isaiah's sublime imagery, "For my sword is bathed in heaven." She points at the grisly rocks with their jags and spear points. Evidently she is beside herself, and thinks she can remember the names of these monsters, born of earthquake and storm, which cannot be named nor known but by sight, and then are known at once perfectly and forever. After traveling through Germany, Belgium, and Holland, the party returned to Paris toward the end of August, from which place Mrs. Stowe writes, I am seated in a snug little room at Monsieur Belloc's. The weather is overpoweringly hot, but these Parisian houses seem to have seized and imprisoned coolness. French household ways are delightful. I like their seclusion from the street by these deep-paned quadrangles. Madame Belloc was the translator of Maria Edgeworth, by that lady's desire, corresponded with her for years, and still has many of her letters. Her translation of Uncle Tom has to me all the merit and all the interest of an original composition. In perusing it, I enjoy the pleasure of reading the story with scarce any consciousness of its ever having been mine." End quote. The next letter is from London, en route for America, to which passage had been engaged on the Collins steamer Arctic. In it Mrs. Stowe writes, quote, "London, August 28th. Our last letters from home changed all our plans. We concluded to hurry away by the next steamer, if at that late hour we could get a passage. We were all in a bustle. The last shoppings for aunts, cousins, and little folks were to be done by us all. The Palais Royal was to be rummaged, bronzes, vases, statuettes, bonbons, playthings, all that the endless fertility of France could show, was to be looked over for the folks at home. How we sped across the Channel, C. relates, we are spending a few very pleasant days with our kind friends, the L's, in London. On board the Arctic, September 7th. On Thursday, September 1, we reached New York, and visited the beautiful ruins of St. Mary's Abbey and the magnificent cathedral. It rained with inflexible pertinacity during all the time we were there, and the next day it rained still when we took the cars for Castle Howard Station. Lady Carlisle welcomed us most affectionately, and we learned that had we not been so reserved at the York Station in concealing our names, we should have received a note from her. However, as we were safely arrived, it was of no consequence. Our friends spoke much of Sumner and Prescott, who had visited there, also of Mr. Lawrence, our former ambassador, who had visited them just before his return. After a very pleasant day, we left with regret the warmth of this hospitable circle, thus breaking one more of the links that bind us to the English shore. 9 o'clock in the evening found us sitting by a cheerful fire in the parlor of Mr. E. Baines at Leeds. The next day the house was filled with company, and the Leeds offering was presented. Tuesday we parted from our excellent friends in Leeds, and soon found ourselves once more in the beautiful Dingle, our first and last resting place on English shores. A deputation from Belfast, Ireland, here met me, presenting a beautiful bog oak casket lined with gold and carved with appropriate national symbols, containing an offering for the cause of the oppressed. They read a beautiful address, and touched upon the importance of inspiring with principles of emancipation the Irish nation, whose influence in our land is becoming so great. Had time and strength permitted, it had been my purpose to visit Ireland, to revisit Scotland, and to see more of England. But it is not in man that walketh to direct his steps. And now came parting, leave-taking, last letters, notes, and messages. Thus, almost sadly, as a child might leave its home, I left the shores of kind, strong old England, the mother of us all. End of Chapter 10. Read for you by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana.